Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Lancaster University China Centre and Confucius Institute's joint seminar series. Today, we are very delighted to welcome two of our really leading young scholars in the management school at Lancaster University, Yu Fu and Zoe Zhu. Going to be talking about organizational cultural differences between China and Chinese and Japanese companies, and in particular, trying to do this without straying into an essentialist type of perspective. And it's going to be fascinating to see how we can square that circle. So very briefly, just to introduce our two speakers today. Yu Fu is a teaching fellow in the Department of Organization, Work and Technology in LUMS. She does lecturing in human resource management and organizational behavior, and her research lies in international human resources management, and particularly looking at national cultural factors in employment. Now, Zoe is also an international teaching fellow in the Department of Organization, Work and Technology. She teaches management and marketing in the China campus as well as in the Bellevue campus in Lancaster. And originally being an ethnographer, she's interested in corporate culture, particularly in the eras of globalization and the formation and dissemination and interpretation of corporate ideology, particularly in Japanese companies in East Asia, with whom she's done a lot of on-the-ground research. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Zoe, who's going to take the first part of the presentation, and then she'll bring in you for the next part. I think overall you'll be talking for about 35, 40 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to put the slides up and over to you, Zoe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Andrew. So we are very delighted to talk about our ongoing research. So it would be great if we can get a lot of insights from the audience as well. So just to give you a sense of what we are going to talk about today, first, I would like to talk about the introduction for our research. So next slide, please.
Sorry, Zoe, if you could just pause for a second. I'm not sure the slides are coming through just yet. So, sorry, just bear with us 1 second. Doesn't look like we've quite got the slides coming through, so I'm going to share the slides from my computer. We'll see if that makes a difference. Oh yes, it has to be me apparently sharing the slides. So desktop number 2. And I think we're okay now. So please go on, Zoe.
Okay, great. So could you also start the slides, please? Yes. So for our research, the main purpose is to explore the cross-cultural issues by organizations in China and Japan. So these are the two countries we are going to focus on our research. Especially, we would like to talk about the management policies and how they are implemented and practiced in the reality. And the second point is that we understand and acknowledge that it's really difficult to analyze culture as a whole entity, meaning that Chinese culture, what is Chinese culture and what is Japanese culture? But in our research, we also want to focus or to point out that there are, because of the cultural difference, there are a lot of obstacles nowadays existing in the cross-cultural management. Next, please. So Andrew, can you point the next, please? I think there are something wrong with probably.
It looks like it's frozen.
Yes. Yes. So you do you want to?
I can upload. I can share the slides if you want.
Yeah. That would be good.
Yeah, I just the computer today is just not happy to help us for some reason.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe you can just continue the point.
So should we start from here? The issues in the management studies in China and Japan. Yeah. Okay. So we are kind of challenging the take for granted assumptions on national culture and organizational culture in both countries. Because normally when people or even the scholars talking about culture in Asia, East Asia especially, and then immediately people will say, oh yeah, Confucianism, right? That's a very simplistic view in the cultural study. It's presumably is because Confucianism has been well advocated by the scholars that's been influential in the West, and their work and research has been heavily referenced in different areas when writing, especially in the management studies as well. So we are trying to challenge that predefined culture values in East Asia in general, trying to think out of trying to break that box of of these stereotypes, if you like, right? And say, okay, instead of saying China is culture A, Japanese culture B, especially if you're familiar with Hofstede cultural dimensions, then they put different values for the culture norms. For example, power distance, Japanese is 78, China is 77, for example, or individualism or collectivism. So when they're trying to put this Chinese or Asian culture into those predefined boxes, the question we ask here, are they still valid? Can we simply just generalize and saying that, all the cultural values in other countries also can fit in those frameworks, in those dimensions, right? So that's why we take a non-essentialist perspective when examining or exploring the national cultural values and norms in both countries. The other the other objective of the research is trying to distinguish national culture and organizational culture, although they are interdependent, but they're different. So we're trying to distinguish how national culture and organizational culture they interplay, they interact in both contexts. The last one is a key argument. I would say probably the most important argument in this developmental paper is the power or the role of the individual employees or the human beings in organizations, right? We're going to explain or explore further in our slides later on. So how we come to this idea of comparing Japanese and Chinese culture in the management field, because as Andrew already introduced, Zoe and I, we're both from the culturalist research domain. She joined us last year. We had several informal chat as a colleague, as a friend, and then we discovered that, oh, you know, when we're talking about the Chinese culture and Japanese culture, based on our research as well as in our personal experience, there are many common points. However, they are very different from each other. So based on the research we have been working on in the past few years, you just know the idea, meaning Zoe proposed, how about we could link these two, you know, cultural systems together and see, you know, the latest or the contemporary development in this area in order to answer or address some potential research gaps that's being argued by some of the scholars, especially from the non-essentialist perspective. So we mainly will challenge the influence of Confucianism in China and in Japan. What is Confucianism? Is it still be considered as an ideology in both societies, or it's something that's been fixed, or has been changed, has been evolved in the past few decades, right? And how the Confucianism being adopted or used by the organizations as well as the government, especially in the next in the past few decades. And then based on literature, we'll, as I mentioned, I think briefly already, you know, to examine the role of the Confucianism in the management practices in Japanese and Chinese companies, and how they are different, and how exactly they influence or they affect the practice and the policies of management in a broad context. So the implications of our study would be to provide a holistic overview of both Chinese and Japanese culture and its impact on management studies, and examine the cultural values from the non-essentialist perspective, highlight the importance of examining or investigating human as the agent in this whole process, right? In the process of the management, in a process when we're constructing the reality around us. We're going to discuss the agency theory later on as well, and propose further opportunities for non-essentialist approach that could be used in the cultural studies. Zoe, pass to you.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our theoretical grounds. The first one is that, as our title shows, what do we mean by non-essentialist paradigm? You already gave a quite good introduction to this, is that basically we want to illustrate the importance or the influence of local culture. So it's not just about Chinese culture equals this, but it also has the organizational culture, and we need to consider different aspects of so-called local culture as well. And the second point is that we want to criticize the oversimplification of the notion of culture, like you also already mentioned, is that China equals to, for example, Confucianism. And we understand that's definitely oversimplification, but how can we overcome that kind of oversimplification by introducing this non-essentialist paradigm? So we would like to see culture as a changing, negotiated meaning process, rather than culture equals to X or Y or Z. And the second type of theoretical grounds we would like to use in our research is proposed by Chen in 2010, Asia as a method, because we understand that some of the theories are quite imperialized or Western centralized kind of theory. So we would like to try to de-imperialize, as Chen mentioned, and to see the complexity in the East Asia, even though we understand there are cultural similarity in those areas, but there are also differences. So we would like to explore this transnationality of culture by making Confucianism as an example to talk about this complexity. So the final theoretical grant we would like to use is as you mentioned, structure and agency. So in our research, we would like to see individual or human being as an active agent rather than try to see this as a dictated by social structure. So we will dedicate one slide to talk about how individual play an active role in management. Okay, next slide, please. So for the methodology, we basically review the literature. For the Chinese company, we basically looking at the post-1980s. For Japan, it's slightly earlier because there are much earlier literature comparing to the literature on Chinese management. And basically for this research, we focus only on the English literature, and we looking at the companies type like the Chinese and Japanese company. This may include both domestic or multinational or company overseas. And we would like to review different types of approach on culture, either essentialist or non-essentialist, and to try to see the role of Confucianism in management. So we use Confucianism as an example to compare. We are not saying that, oh, this is the only example we can use to talk about culture. But in our research, we selected Confucianism because we found that, like you also mentioned earlier, there are some commonalities in Chinese and Japanese management culture. So we would like to focus on 3 particular items. The first is interpersonal relationship, second is harmony, and third is respect for agent hierarchy. But plus this, we also would like to talk a little bit about humor as an active agency in management and also other potential factors to consider. Okay, next slide, please. So I think you start first. I think you're on mute.
Is it better now? Okay, so I put the slides back. Is it still the slides up? Never mind. Here's the slides now. Is the slides up? I cannot hear you.
Yes.
It's all fine.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I was really just panic when I cannot hear anything. There we go. So I will talk about. So there are 5 different cultural values we're going to discuss in the next probably 10-20 minutes, and I will start with Japanese. No, I will start with Chinese side first, and then we'll compare. And Zoe will discuss the Japanese side. So we're going to compare both of them together. So first one is Confucianism. It is, historically, traditionally, it's been considered as the root of the Chinese culture. And normally, when we talk about Confucianism, that means compassion, moral cultivation, and respect, the age and hierarchy, and also the value of the importance of developing interpersonal relationships. However, there was a debate to whether a shift to Confucianism as a unifying framework is a positive, that leading the improvement that's in the quality of the society of individuals. In other words, are we, following this moral standards proposed by, Confucianism and say, oh, we'll become a better person, or it's being used as a tool to control our behavior and attitudes, either by the government or by the organizations, or both. At the same time, people probably want to become a better person, and at the same time, because the message is sent by the central government, as well as being prevalently implemented by at the local level, no matter it's an organization or at the provincial level, that we tend to behave in a way that's desired by certain groups, no matter, again, it's organization or the government, right? Or how the really how they interlink. So yeah, the Confucianism, it's as we mentioned earlier, it's being simply regarded as a general rule that we follow in China. However, we cannot overlook or ignore what happened before 1980s. Although Zoe said, now literature we're mainly, for the Chinese side, we're mainly look at the literature from 1980s. However, what happened before that, for example, the Maoism or the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, right? The not destroyed, but they greatly challenged the foundation of Confucianism, and especially the parents, my parents in their generation. The working culture, the values they had within is quite different from the young generations like us, or even younger generations like Generation Z. So people like us, comparatively the younger ones, we've been some of us being educated in the West, or been working in the West, imposed the values from the Western countries or Japanese cultural values. So how we, when we are working towards or interact with Chinese employees or the scholars or in the Chinese community, how that, how can we influence the perceptions and the views within the country as well? I could move to you, Zoe, for the Japanese side. So I'll just share the slide.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I will say in Japan, there are a lot of debates about if the Confucianism is still some concept that has a large impact in Japan. So I think the study by Paramore has a different, I would say, interesting perspective on the influence of Confucianism in Japan. So he basically said there are multiple Confucianism in Japan, and the role of Confucianism has changed, for example, from 402 Common Era to 20th centuries. But I will say in the modern literature, there might be less and less mentioning of Confucianism, but there are also a lot of studies pointed out there are philosophical impact on Japanese management by the Confucianists. But there are also some studies claim that the Confucianism is not that illustrated that much comparing to the literature about Chinese culture, is because the concept itself, it has already been kind of emerged or immersed into modernized Japanese thoughts. For example, hybridized with Zen thoughts, or Shintoism, Bushido, those kind of different thoughts. So there are also arguments like that. But I think one of the core thing about Japanese management culture is that to consider company as a family. So that ideology started, I will say, it has been emphasized, I will say, post-World War II, but it's still kind of prominent in Japan to consider family equals to community, like local community, your neighborhood equals to company. So your company needs to be considered the same kind of importance as your family. So it's not just a place to get money. So that's why you have to have a paternalistic practices in management to kind of sustain the family as a company kind of ideology. And also some people say that this Confucianism or relation to family or the importance of family is still kind of influential in Japanese business management. And next point there will be, so we are thinking that we would like to kind of ask, or the question of, is this Confucianism a continuing legacy or reimagining this concept in the modern Chinese or Japanese management culture? Okay, good.
Yeah, now we move on to the interpersonal relationship. Normally we call it guanxi in Chinese. What's the word in Japanese, Zoe?
I don't think there is a similar kind of connection. The term probably different.
Yeah, but we'll elaborate the meaning of this relationship in details in the slides. So in the Chinese context, as I mentioned, it's about the guanxi. It's a kind of mostly probably the second most frequently referenced Chinese culture value in the management studies, right? So it means it is a link. You know, we're in a linked society. Everyone trying to, you know, get to know each other in order to, if we focus on the last bullet point of the Chinese, the box, it's, you know, are we just exchanging resources, the knowledge, no matter it's explicit, tacit, or we're really seeking a long-term relationship, as long-term orientation was the fifth culture values proposed by Hofstede based on Bond study in 1987. The critique about the study of bonds we're going to discuss later on as well, but it's worth noting that you know, what's the meaning of practicing those guanxi exercise, right? Is it to making each other the favor, or is it truly consider someone as a friend or as a partner that you could work with, or you know, in a longer term? Zoe, I'll pass to you.
Yeah, I will say actually in Japan, if people involved with a Chinese, you know, business, they know this guanxi. But I will say in Japanese, probably I think it's similar to renji guanxi Chinese kind of. So it's not the guanxi, but it has different kind of meaning, I think, in Chinese. But anyway, so in Japan, the interpersonal relationship, basically the important thing is that we sustain this long-term or lifetime relationship. And that's also based on the lifetime employment system that was employed basically in a large-scale Japanese company, mostly in Japan, but also in overseas as well. And another thing, very interesting thing is the family name matters. For example, so being a worker in a Toyota, it's more important to say, okay, I'm engineer. So in Japan, the name of the family or the name of the company really is important factor when you introduce, you know, yourself to other person. And because of this kind of family clan ideology, so they like to distinguish insider, they call it uchi, or outsider like soto. So uchi, our company is like this, so your company is like that. So that's how they want to kind of tend to distinguish their family clan to others. So in order to sustain this family ideology, like I said, they usually practice this paternalistic leadership and management, basically saying son or equals to, I will say, subordinate, obeys father, or I will say manager or supervisor. And also your father or the manager needs to be a role model in the family. And that's another thing, kind of morality thing they also emphasize in Japanese management culture. And the vertical principle proposed by one of the very famous kind of Japanologists called Nakane-chie, she basically saying that if you are meeting strangers, basically it's all dependent on your ranks. It also relates to the next point, that the respected age and hierarchy. So everybody is kind of vertically placed in the organization. And to sustain this kind of, you know, paternalistic and also vertical relationship, you need to have a socialization process. And this could be done, for example, institutional training. So that's why one of the things is in Japanese management culture, they value a lot on the job training rather than kind of outside training. And also informal gatherings like drinking, alcohol parties. Nowadays, it's really, they say one of the probably reason in Japan to have the increasing coronavirus kind of patient is also because of the, you know, that you cannot stop this informal gathering, you know, outside or drinking. But also there are some people saying respect and the reciprocal obligation is also important, same as in family. So you have to respect whoever, you know, elderly or, you know, your supervisor, and also you have to do something for others, and to in return the other, you also need to do something for them. So basically what we think is that when we talk about interpersonal relationship, the purpose of the relationship building and also the time frame, is that long-term or short-term or hybrid, is also something we should consider.
Thank you, Zoe. So you can see the interpersonal relationship in the Japanese context is slightly different from the ones in China, which is well linked with respect for age and hierarchy aspects in China. It's I would say it's quite similar, because normally we would say it's because it's a vertical principle you have to follow. Respect for seniorities based on their age or their experience or the organizational or social ranks. So it's highly valued. Otherwise, at the same time, it's also being rephrased as power distance, if you want to use the predefined cultural values from Hofstede and other Western cultural scholars. So the in terms of the respect of the seniority, a heavily influenced interaction and communication between the employers and employees, because you are expected to follow the orders, especially in a hierarchical, hierarchical organization with bureaucracy, for example. The Western companies who have subsidiaries in China, they trying to, or what if the other flat management, the style they've been promoting or they've been trying to implement in the Chinese context is challenging those traditional respect model, I would say, in state-owned enterprises, as well as the probably family-run business in China as well. Zoe, I'll pass to you.
Yeah, so in Japan, if you have ever looked at or talked about Japanese management culture, I think seniority-based promotion is something very well known. I think even beyond academia, many people overseas, if they work for a Japanese company, they will say, oh, in Japan, it's really slow to have a promotion because it's based on the seniority, and you just have to wait for your turn. And another thing is honorific language is very important in Japan. I mean, of course, in China, there are like a ning and a ni. There is a difference on that honorific side. But in Japan, it has much more, I would say, honorific language towards how you can speak to your supervisor, how you should write an email to your manager is something very, very important. I think that's one of the disadvantage for international labor who has, a basic language ability of, Japanese language. So the rationality behind the system, because every system has kind of rationality. They're not just doing it because they don't see any advantage, but there are some advantage. From their perspective, they think that if you have this seniority-based promotion or respect for age and hierarchy kind of system, they can better help them to raise more generalists than specialists. So basically generalist meaning that you have a wider skill, but it's a much kind of, I won't say shallower, but not that deep enough like a specialist. If you have a more generalist in the company, you can allow the flexibility and efficiency, meaning that if there is one spot vacancy, you can just assign anyone in the organization because everybody has a similar skills. But in order to have a difference, there are also kind of depends on the length of your work life in the organization, meaning that you have a wider skill, meaning you are more senior than others, meaning that you have to be respected. And so there is also a debate on the efficiency of ringi system. So ringi is also another, I think it's kind of Japanese, not Japanese unique, but when you say Japanese management culture, this is also illustrated as obstacles in the international management. The ringi system is basically you have to get all the levels managers' approval before you conduct a new proposal. So basically in many Chinese companies, I think the decision process, I think it's much more speedy than Japanese large-scale companies because they just have to go through this in order to kind of sustain this kind of vertical relationship or respect for hierarchy. But like Peter Drucker, he also mentioned this and says that it's actually quite efficient because as long as you get all the approval from all the levels, you won't have any obstacles in the process of implementing the new things. But either way, so for this respect for agent hierarchy or seniority-based promotion as an example, this may not be that important or influential in our overseas Japanese company because they understand or acknowledge that there are a lot of debates and the critics on the Japanese management culture. I will say traditional Japanese management culture. So they want to create an image that, oh, we are not Japanese company. We are very modernized or non-Japanese management. So they kind of emphasize on the fast speed promotion in overseas Japanese company. So the final point, so we want to kind of show that there are definitely difference when we are talking about domestic kind of company or overseas company, because they will have the differences. That's all.
Thank you, Zoe. Yeah, just want to expand a bit based on what Zoe said, because the reason we put this domestic and overseas comparison is, imagine when a Chinese company investing abroad in other countries, in the West, in Japan, in Singapore, for example, and would they adapt, would they change their management practices based on the local culture? At the same time, when the Western companies investing in China and in Japan, can they transfer the standardized or westernized or the best practices that being adopted in their headquarters or being successfully implemented in other regions? Do they need to consider the local factors based on no matter the cultural one, institutional one, economic one, social one? So we're going to move on to the harmony, which is one of the elements of the Confucianism, which advocates again, stability, social stability, and moral behavior, for example. So the question we would ask here is, so the harmony is being used as an ideology of compliance with the social norms expected by the organizations and the government, or it's something that we truly encourage people to fulfill their potentials and their abilities. Yeah, so the first Chinese high-speed train is named as Harmony, right? So that's the message sent from the central government. But in the daily practice in management fields, how those harmony are being practiced is worth investigating further.
Yeah, same as in China, I would say harmony, or in Japanese it's called wa, is a very, very kind of important ideology. I think is also kind of propaganda by the government or by the by the companies as well. So if you have ever been to a kind of souvenir shop, you will find a lot of souvenirs, say with wa kind of in the gift shop. So there are also some discussions says that wa or harmony plays a role as a guiding philosophy for business relations in Japan. So you should not, for example, in the meeting to have a strong disagreement in front of others towards, for example, for your managers. So that's, I think, some of the thing. If you have ever experience have an opportunity to work in a Japanese organization as a junior, that's definitely something you should be aware of. And also because of this harmony, they want to go through this ideology to increase or require collective responsibility, because you need to sustain this harmonious relationship. So it's your and also others kind of responsibility to keep everything in harmonious way, or silent, or less disagreement kind of ways, I will say. So I think this harmony plays an important role in the Japanese management to enhance this company as family ideology, like I said before, because you don't want son and the father to have so many conflicts in the organization. It's difficult to kind of solve. But also to create an imagined community by strangers, because when you join an organization, it's like you join another family with different types of people that you probably haven't met before. And in order to, create this ideology or enhance this ideology harmonious way, to keep this harmony is a different good way for, strangers or new people to join well or adapt well to this Japanese organization. But that doesn't mean that they don't have complaints. They just don't, show that. so clearly. So we believe that harmony kind of plays a tool or ideology for top management. Yes.
Thank you, Zoe. And then it comes to the last cultural values that we will discuss for this seminar, before the conclusion and discussion. As both Zoe and I mentioned earlier, the power of the agent in the structuring of the society or in organization is very important, because in China normally we say, it's the system is organized, or say it's managed by people, by men rather than by rules. There's a difference between 人治 and 体制. So that illustrates the flexibility or autonomy that the individual employee, especially the people at the management level, so they have this freedom or they have this margin to exercise their own interpretation of the management practices, especially the ones being transferred from the headquarters in other countries. And they normally call it the art of Chinese leadership, right? Meaning that they don't need to, they don't 100% follow or the rules being stand by the headquarters or the parent company, but with this bit adaptation or the integration with the local elements, for example. So the humans as an agency, we're mainly talking about the different interpretation and the perception of the employees on those management practices. Zoe?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, definitely, I agree with what you said. Like 人治体制, I mean, same in Japan, but I will say the degree of the influence of 人治 probably is slightly different. I will say less, but there are still kind of influence of the human beings on management. And I would like to raise the example of disseminating corporate philosophy, for example. So corporate philosophy is quite, I will say, an important thing to be, I will say, if you look at the Japanese companies, the large companies, or even family-sized small companies, most of them have a corporate philosophy on either on their website or on their corporate manual handbook. So they place emphasis a lot on the morality or the importance of philosophy or value mission kind of things in the company. And in order to disseminate, for example, if you have a corporate philosophy to say, okay, serve the customers with our best, for example, if you have that kind of philosophy, you need to have a translator, meaning that it's not literally just translate, but also to have to translate a lot aligning with the corporate strategy, for example. So from the translation to interpretation process seems to be really simple, but actually it's quite complicated, because the philosophy always is not that reflected in the reality. That's the reality, I will say. And also we need to look at the historical development, for example, of that particular company, what they emphasize on, how about the founder legacy, or do they emphasize on standardization or localization? And we also would like to point out that the limit of institutional control, because we are like the human beings, and sometimes we are probably emotional, or we will interpret the philosophy in a quite different way. And my personal research is also interested in one of this area, and I think this is quite influential, especially in overseas, when you have to translate the Japanese written philosophy to local language plus the manual, for example. And I find that in the customer service field, for example, if you're a Japanese retailer, you want other people in other countries or regions to perform the same standard of Japanese kind of way to serve people. If you have ever been to Japan, you will find that they're kind of obsessed with this customer service, and they will call it hospitality, Japanese style of hospitality, like called omotenashi. So they want other people to follow that, but I will say it's lost in the translation, in the sense that they translate how to do everything from Japanese to, for example, Chinese or other language. But if the people in that region have no idea what you're talking about or have the different ideas of, for example, smile, these are simple kind of things, but what do you mean by smile? Probably different. And so that's something that we definitely have to consider. And that's why we say here, human as an active agency in management.
I think we have 30 minutes left. So Zoe, shall we just end our conversation with the two figures that you put them together? The first, this one, and also the last one with the oval shapes. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So we leave a bit, more time for the audience to raise questions. So there are other factors could be considered when we're investigating the culture in China and Japan. So, for example, this first one will be involution rather than evolution. So, which means I think it's not unfamiliar to Chinese audience. Right, since the resources are limited and they're trying to compete and get the best they can. So they're in the end they compete for nothing. For example, 996. If everyone's working 996 in the Chinese organizations, that becomes a normal working pattern, and which is unhealthy and unproductive, and it's non-beneficial in the longer term for both employees and employers. And a nationalistic ideology, I think, is quite prominent in both countries, especially in the past few decades. And Zoe, do you want to talk about the gender role and the nature of organization?
Yeah. So for the gender role, we discussed that what is expected to, for example, for a female graduate to do in her future life. That's definitely, I will say, quite different if we compare China and Japan, where I will say, so a fewer female workers probably are in the workplace in Japan comparing to China. But there are also some more to explore here. And the nature of organization is slightly similar to what we discussed before, is that we definitely have to consider, is this, for example, profit-oriented kind of company, or is it NPO, or is it in a multinational company or transnational company, or is it domestic or outside of that country? So there are a lot of factors we should consider.
Thank you, Zoe. I just skipped the test. The slides was cast because I think this figure that drew by Zoe could summarize our research very well and clearly.
Yeah, so this is a quite simple illustration to say that what kind of factors we need to consider when we want to study a company's culture or the role of national culture in management from a non-essentialist kind of perspective. Is that first thing is definitely the complexity of culture. So Chinese culture and Japanese culture are definitely changing. So that's, and also complex in terms of the process of change. And the transnationality of culture, what we would like to say is there are similarities, of course, and also there are changes and the differences if we compare these two quite, inherited both Confucianism kind of ideology. And we also want to illustrate the human as an active agency and also the importance of including the perspective of organizational culture. That's all.
Thank you for your patience and thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna turn the microphone and shut up because there's lots of background noise probably. Here we are.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Zoe, and you for a really refreshing perspective that really breaks down the idea of Confucianism into actual component parts that are quite meaningful and relevant to organizational practices, but then also really exploring some of the differences in different Confucianisms. And I think it really leaves us with that sort of open question that's been debated for many decades now about whether Confucianism is a thing, whether it is a single thing to talk about. And we've certainly got a lot of evidence here of how there are, at a minimum, there's multiple Confucianisms. Now, I've got a number of questions for both of you, but since time is short and we have a number of questions in the chat, I'm going to resist abusing the chair's prerogative and skip straight into the questions. I've got 3 questions here actually from Richard. So I might start with those before I go through the other ones that have come in as well. So first question, has management culture been imported from Western business practices, or was there an existing management culture in China and Japan that has developed with reference to Western practice? That's question 1, existing management cultures in China and Japan. Second question, also from Richard, is that there's a lot of advice books about doing business in China and Japan. So what are your views on this, the relevance and accuracy of these advice books that kind of emphasize Chinese and Japanese organizational differences with Western culture? Is the advice oversimplified? Do the companies react differently according to whether they're dealing with other Asian or Western companies? And then thirdly, is there a surface level culture in China and Chinese and Japanese management culture that perhaps appears Western, but in reality the management culture is more deeply rooted in a traditional culture that's actually quite different from the Western exterior? So those are 3 questions from Richard, and I will leave it to both of you to work out who wants to take which parts.
Thank you, Richard, for your question. Zoe, should I answer the first one, or?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, if the culture that imported or they're already existing in both countries, I would say it's mixed. As we mentioned earlier, the culture is dynamic, it's evolving, it's not static. So that's the importance of evaluating or examining the culture norms in a longer term, rather than just say, we just look at a specific time frame and say, okay, based on hostage or the house and their survey and Chinese culture or Japanese culture, that like this. So we need to consider all those the factors of influence from not only from the West, really. So for example, what's going on nowadays because the pandemic, and also the commercial war, if you want to call it, between China and US especially, or in the West in general, right? So that all those factors cannot be overlooked when we examine the contemporary Japanese and the Chinese cultures.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add that, if we are talking about Japanese management, I think that's definitely a good point because we haven't included that much in our presentation. So for the Japanese management, if you have ever heard of Toyota Way, for example, it's a lean management. So there are a lot of discussions saying that scientific management idea has been introduced to Japan in a quite early time. So how Japanese are obsessed, right, with the efficiency, with the productivity, and with the quality. So that's definitely something we can say about the first one. And I will just say for my comments for the second and the third, and maybe you can add later. For the second advice book, I will say if you are experts, you have to go to Japan and you don't have time to do a prior training, this advice book will be definitely useful. Because for example, I don't know anything about other countries or other culture. You have to have some kind of oversimplified, but it will be a good guide for you to what to do and what not to do. But based on my talk with people in Japan and who stayed in Japan for over 10 years, there are still some points that they don't understand. So that's definitely something you will probably face in the future, but definitely a good start. Yeah. So that's.
Yeah, I just want to add a bit about the advice for Western business people wishing to do business in China and Japan. Is any books or the articles that I could recommend? I would say there is a common, not misunderstanding or a mistake, but it's the common issue among the Western researchers or the publications on Japanese and Chinese management studies is most of the data that were collected from the management members. Very few of them truly ask the perception and views of the employees at the bottom level. So imagine we ask the company, we ask the managers, especially the senior ones, or even the one at the middle level, and the managerial members, how's the practices being implemented? Of course, you know, they will say it's great, it's been really successful, and everyone's happy, you know, at a surface level, you know, and because there's very limited research, it's being conducted or collected data from the actual employees, you know, so the voice is being, I would say, lost in this process. So I'm not saying, you know, totally ignore the research has been done in the past. It's just when we're looking at the Chinese culture values and Japanese ones, we should not take for granted, say, okay, what they say is really what happened in China or in Japan. It's you know, always being critical, you know, and read more probably, you know, it's recently I have I don't know, yeah, keep the story short. So recently I have a module of, you know, it's about international HRM, and the students are trying to use the newspaper article, the assessments about the newspaper article review, and the students are trying to get the news of the Xinjiang cotton from H&M that, you know, was quite predominant in the news a few weeks ago. So they said, can I use this newspaper and to do my assessment? And I'm saying, I said you can, but you cannot simply rely on the news that's released in the West, right? Because the story in China is completely different. So that's important that we have those neutral position or this holistic view when we're looking at the, you know, especially culture issues or those sociology or human rights issues in all the contexts, I would say. So I had yeah.
Can I just add a little bit for the third question about the surface level? I will say, if you go to a Chinese company, like a large company or you know, a branch of a foreign company in China, I assume more people can speak English right now than in Japan. I will say, so if you don't know how to speak Japanese, and if you are sent to Japan as an expert, the first thing you will notice is that you don't know what's going on. So you ask me if there is a commonality that, you know, it also exists in West, but it's still a kind of traditional culture. I will say probably at the beginning, you just will see everything as a quite confusing or strange thing, I think. Yeah, that's cool.
Terrific. Thank you both. Now, we're just at time, but we have a few more questions to ask. So what I'll do is just quickly invite anyone who needs to leave. By all means, just duck out, and you're more than welcome to catch up on the remainder of the discussion in the recording that will be released. It should be available at the original Teams link, but it will also be posted on YouTube afterwards as well. But given the technical issues that we had, I think it's reasonable that we go over a little bit and try and get through some more of the audience's questions. So I'll take another 3 that have appeared in the chat, and you can do with those what you will. First question on Confucianism. You made mention of moral cultivation, harmony, respect for age, emphasis on education, these types of Confucian values. But what about the disesteem of commerce? How is this aspect of Confucianism reconciled with management culture of a commercial enterprise? And then I'd probably tack on to that the idea of harmony. How is it that with the emphasis on harmony that seems to be common to the different Confucianisms of China and Japan, how is that reconciled with the need to compete in a cutthroat capitalist marketplace, if that's not too simplistic an addition from myself? Another question is a pretty simple one. Is there data about whether employees in Japan stay with a company longer on average than in China? And if so, does that represent those differences that you mentioned between China and Japan about guanxi versus something different in the Japanese context, something more longer term and less transient, perhaps, than the Chinese business concept of guanxi? And then a third question, in China, there are different types of companies, state-owned and private ones. So briefly, what are the differences between those in terms of management culture and the influence of that management culture on the practices?
Thank you for the questions. And Zoe, do you want to start with the first one? Because I'm not quite sure about this esteem of commons.
So if I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but so what I'm thinking about Japan is that this moral cultivation does not necessarily kind of conflict with the profit earning kind of aspect, because it's a spiritual training. So I think in Japan, the important thing is that if you I mean, if you're a merchant or, you know, if you're working in a company, the important thing for you to think is not to earn money. So of course, people will say, okay, I need money, but you need to have a higher moral standard to say that, okay, company is for the society's good. So I'm not sure in China, probably the whole society, the situation is different. It's also linked to the education and the stability and the economic development of that country. So I think that's something probably for the first question, right? And probably that also linked to the harmony and how that survive in a competing kind of society. And I think, of course, Japan is a competitive society, you know, as a whole, but it's much less, I will say, in some way comparing to China. So that's why Japanese university students, they don't want to go to overseas. They just want to stay in Japan to enjoy the whatever they can do in Japan, because they believe Japan is the, you know, a good country enough for them rather than going overseas. So I will say that's definitely quite interesting thing to see, and how the harmony can survive in a Japanese organization. I think it only survives kind of in a very large scale company or very small kind of company that has a more family kind of ideology, and also kind of based on seniority promotion or kind of respect for hierarchy. And that's something kind of also support this harmony can survive in this competing society. Yeah, that's all for the first question.
Yeah, I think there's another question from Katrina asking about any changes in terms of management culture given to the younger generation, their experience. And yeah, so I would say, okay, you know, one of the references that we put in the slides, in 1990s, some scholars already pointed out, you know, due to the influence of the West, of the young generation, no matter if they're educated or the social, the media, the fashion trend, etc., being prevalent in China, the attitudes towards the meaning of work or the values, social values, has been not being changed. I'm not sure change this is a proper term, but definitely the attitudes towards, for example, the employment stability has been changed, I would say. The younger generation, they tend to have more challenging tasks or the job, rather than staying in a lifelong employment, which is being kind of promoted in the state-owned enterprises. Yeah, Zoe, can you think of any other points that were relevant to the changing of the culture?
Or the differences in the state-owned and the commercial sector in China, whether one is more Confucian or culturally inflected in their management style than the other.
You mean China, right?
Yeah, this was the third anonymous question. Yeah, the different types of companies, state-owned and private companies. I think that's what it was getting at, whether whether there's a difference between a state-owned. I mean, as a political scientist who studies Chinese politics, I would expect there to be quite different management styles in a state-owned enterprise versus a commercial enterprise, given the nature of political control in China.
I would say in China, because the state-owned enterprises being owned by the government, if I can say that way, but with there are very strict protocols to follow in terms of appointment of the leadership and the management members, and also the actual management practices they could implement. It's been highly controlled and monitored by the state. But in terms of private ones, I think there are two main groups. One is the transnational corporations have subsidiaries in China, and another one is a private owned, wholly owned by the Chinese local companies, for example. In terms of the business culture, yeah, that's a really good question. I think for the multinational companies, for the subsidiaries of multinational companies, as I think related with another question, at the surface level, they try to maintain this consistency or this standardization transferred from their headquarters. But at the bottom level or at the micro level, when coming to the individual level, when actually implementing those practices, as we mentioned, the interpretation of those transferred practices can be adapted or integrated with the local factors. The private ones, I didn't do much research about the private companies in China, but I could probably share one. One of the models used by the Geely, this 100% owned Chinese-owned company, and they have their own private university in Beijing as well. And this company, they bought 100% of the shares of Volvo car in 2010, back in 11 years ago. So when they started this partnership with a Swedish automobile manufacturer, they didn't transfer the Chinese management style, so-called, to their Swedish partner or to Europe. They left the full management autonomy to their partners to run the business and the manufacturers in Europe. So this private Chinese company, they consider as a Swedish partner as the regional quota in the West, but at the same time, they would appreciate, or they are sharing the technology, advanced technology that's being researched within the company.
Thanks. Just got one final round of questions before we finish up. One because you've very kindly addressed Katrina's question on the younger generations. Question from Baixue of Lancaster University China Center, PhD student, asking about the culture in Japan of, and I'm not going to know the Japanese pronunciation, but maybe Zoe can help us, 读空气, or meaning literally read air. It seems to be a form of harmony that it specifically exists in Japan. So can you talk a bit about that and the importance of it for Japanese companies? And then a final question, which I guess also goes towards Zoe, since it's Japan specific, but the anonymous questioner has read a book called The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi, and talked about the Bushido way of, just as the warrior waits for an opponent to strike, that in a similar way, Japanese negotiators wait for the foreign personnel to talk or speak first in negotiations in order to allow the opponent to reveal their moves or to allow the negotiator to reveal some information. So the questioner would like to know whether this system is still prevalent in Japan today, when Japanese businessmen negotiate with foreign personnel?
Thank you. I think actually these two questions are quite relevant to each other because 读空气 is in Japanese 空気を読む. I think it basically literally translate to read between the lines, probably in English, is that I did actually a corporate kind of training before, and I kind of talked about how you can observe Japanese. Because when you talk to Japanese, you have to observe them really carefully because they don't show it really clearly, their emotions. And even though they don't like your idea, they won't show it and they won't say it during the meeting. That's why many international kind of experts feel really confused because no one says anything during the meeting, but after the meeting, they don't do it. So I think one of the thing is, I would say sucking the air is one of the things some Japanese will do. I think it's really hard to do it. But if you notice any kind of behavior like this, meaning that they don't like it, but they won't say it. So there are so many kind of facial movements or some kind of little things that they do, meaning that they don't like it or they like it. So you just cannot trust what they say. So that's what I was thinking about, say about the read between the lines. So sometimes the experience is definitely important, but like advice book might be useful if you're new to that country or region. So I think that's somehow a little bit related to Bushido in a way that when Japanese negotiate, they probably don't say it directly what they want at the beginning, just to ask you, or you say first, and then they will kind of consider, and then after that they will make movements probably in after a few weeks or days. I think another thing is probably they don't want to shame you or make fool of themselves during the negotiation. That's why they don't want to say too loud what they want, but try to see what you want first, and then attack or whatever they do in the negotiation. So that's something maybe they're care of. And another question I didn't answer is that is there still a lot of people in Japan work a lifetime or longer than in China? I'm not sure about comparing to China, but I assume it's much more longer in most of the companies in Japan. I will say large scale companies and also government officials kind of way. But there are also a lot of statistics showing that recently the young people, they want to work longer in a Japanese company, but still, because usually I think the average is 30 or 40 years. If you consider that, it's definitely much longer probably in some of comparing to some of the Chinese companies.
Yeah, I just want to add a bit on that because the turnover among the young Chinese generations in the private companies, no matter it's a multinational one or the local one, is quite high because this idea of stability or the lifelong employment just is not that important as before. However, in state-owned enterprises, they still value this, or that's one of the advantages people they are trying to find a job in state-owned enterprises because it's it's guaranteed, all the benefits, insurance, and also your package and the benefits. So that I think that echoes two different perspectives of in terms of managing employees. One is exclusive, which means they only hire the best and most capable ones and the most productive ones, and they will animate the poor performers. So it's highly competitive. You need to prove yourself. You are the best. You are the most valuable employees to stay in a company. However, in state-owned enterprises, more laid back or it's inclusive perspective on the managing employees, because they will try to find a position. They will try to find out what you can do and then find your position instead, rather than they are trying to select the best of the best. So yeah, that's all.
Can I just add one final thing to that comment? Is that I just said that in Japan, it's still a lot of people want to have a 10-year job, but there is a high temporary worker in Japan, especially for the females. So that's, I think, quite, I won't say strange, but one of the things that's quite different from China, probably.
Terrific. Well, I can see that most of our attendees are actually still here, so obviously the discussion has been a productive one. So I want to thank again our two presenters, Yufu and Zoe Zhu, for a terrific presentation today, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this research collaboration that the two of you have going will shape up over the years, because I think you flagged a lot of future kind of avenues for trying to kind of get at the complexity of the impact of culture in these types of situations. And particularly around this issue of human agency versus structure. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what your collaboration will produce over the coming years. And I'm really glad that we've been able to have you here today to hear about the research at its formative stage. So thank you very much to our audiences, to Adam Wilson for his organizational work as well. And thanks again to our two presenters. Thanks and good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. See you later.
Thank you.